And now let's get started with our feature presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to today's presentation brought to you by the Society of Decision Professionals and the Decision Analysis Society of Informs, which is entitled Ethical Decision Quality, EDQ. I'm pleased to introduce our featured speaker for today, Ali Abbas. Ali Abbas is a professor of industrial and systems engineering at the University of Southern California. He is the author and co-author of numerous research articles and books on decision-making and ethics, including Foundations of Decision Analysis with Ron Howard, Foundations of Multi-Attribute Utility, Next Generation Ethics, Improving Homeland Security Decisions, and his latest book titled Ethical Decision Quality, Building an Ethical Decision Culture. Thank you for being with us, Ali, today. We're thrilled to have you.
Thank you very much, Hilda.
Our moderator for today is Amy Matheson-Day. Executive Director and co-founder of clarityforaction.org, Amy Day coaches and teaches whole-person decision-making to young people and the adults who care about them through one-on-one coaching, online and in-person group courses and workshops. Amy will be our moderator for today and will be moderating the questions to our speaker. Without any further ado, Ali, you have the floor.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Hilda, and thank you. An event like this takes a lot of effort from many people. I'd like to thank the Decision Analysis Society of Informs, Yael. Thank you for your efforts, as well as Nadia, Steve, Ying-Hee, also from the Society of Decision Professionals, Hilda, Diana, Nay, and also, of course, I'd like to thank Amy for moderating the session today. I'm also glad we have this opportunity to talk a little bit about this topic before year's end. So let's get right into it. What I'd like to talk about today is 4 things. We all make decisions. We know as a decision analysis society how to make decisions. The question is, how do you assess the ethical quality of a decision? Are there any impediments if we wanted to incorporate ethical decision quality in an organization? If so, what are the common ones? Is there an opportunity for decision analysts to be involved in organizational ethical decision-making? Could this be an area where there could be more growth for the decision analysis societies and societies, decision professionals? And how do you go about building an organization's what we'll call ethical decision culture? But before we answer those questions, we first need to talk about what does an unethical act mean? And that's the first challenge. When you do a Google search on a dictionary, the first thing that comes up from Merriam-Webster is not conforming to a high moral standard. But there is no global definition on what that is. And so we will have to address that. So here, I'm going to focus on a few things. Deception, harming, and stealing. What we'd like to agree is that when we see one of those in an organization, then this would be flagged as a decision that has ethical sensitivities, and it would require an ethical decision quality assessment. In all of the cases analyzed, we've analyzed over maybe more than 1,000 articles, also orders from the Department of Justice, and many other ethical collapses. One of these factors was at play. So, you know, it's just a thought here. If someone would have raised a flag when one of these items occurred, then it could have prevented some of the ethical collapses. In my book with Ron Howard and also in Howard and Carver, we also talked about deception, harming, and stealing when it comes to ethical decision-making. So where do we stand today? We can reflect here. First question, can you follow the rules of normative decision-making and still make an unethical decision? In other words, can you use decision analysis to decide what is the best way to rob a bank? Can you comply with the legal system and still make an unethical decision? Okay. Can you comply with corporate policies and make an unethical decision? And finally here, can an organization that has integrity in its core values make an unethical decision? Let's take a moment and reflect on those, because this is the status by which many decisions are assessed for ethicality in an organization. Okay, so I will try as much as possible to present data and articles gathered, rather than imposing my point of view at the beginning, just to make this point stand. So to answer those 4 questions, we have many examples from data. In Enron Corporation, once the investigation started, the first thing that Jeffrey Skilling said was, Arthur Andersen and our lawyers took a very close look at the structure and they deemed it appropriate. In Valiant Corporations, when the investigation started, many people in Congress said, we didn't find anything that they were doing that was illegal. And that's the thing that's startling about this. Bethany McLean, who also wrote about Enron, noted the divergence between what was good for investors and what was good for society. A big thing that came up in the data also is a confusion between ethics and compliance. And can compliance policies help or enable unethical acts? Here was a quote also in the Weinstein Group. The employees had contracts saying they will not criticize it or its leaders in any way that could harm the business reputation of any employee or the reputation of the company. That was, if you were compliant, then you couldn't say anything that would harm the reputation of the company or any employee in the company. Okay, so compliance, there's in fact many organizations that have what they call ethics officers are really compliance officers. They check to see if an act is compliant within a corporate policy. All right, now how about this one? Can an organization that has integrity in its core values make an unethical decision? So I looked into that, and the statistics of the percentage of organizations that have integrity in their core values. The number is large. 65% of corporations have integrity in their core values. This was published in an MIT Sloan Review in 2020, including Enron, FTX, Theranos, Wells Fargo before the ethical collapse, all had integrity in their core values. So having integrity in the core values is not necessarily an indication that an organization cannot make an unethical decision. Okay, so what do we do now? That's the state of where we are at. Even those who have integrity in their core values can make unethical decisions. Okay. Yeah, this is the quote from Enron's Kenneth Lay. Enron is a company that deals with everyone with absolute integrity. We want people to go in interaction with Enron and feel that they have been dealt with in the highest possible way as far as integrity and truthfulness. Okay, so that's where we stand. What about ethics courses? The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal published articles questioning the efficacy of ethics courses. They literally asked whether ethics courses are useless and whether business schools can really teach students to be virtuous, given the amount of ethical collapses that we are seeing. The links are below. But no, ethics courses are not useless. They provide awareness, a history of evolution, distinctions for judgment. So there is value from ethics courses. But the question is, if an organization offers ethics training, will it necessarily make ethical decisions? And the answer is no. There are many other factors when it comes to ethical decision-making: mindsets, organizational structures, decision traps, cognitive biases, inconsistencies, motives, stress, well-being, many other elements that are involved. And so just if you are an expert in the history of ethics or in ethics, doesn't mean that you can become good at ethical decision-making necessarily. I found this quote from Benjamin Franklin. He noted that maybe 200 plus years ago, 250 now, talking about the Constitution while they were writing it. And he said, when you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, local interests, and selfish views. And he wondered, from such an assembly, can a perfect production be expected? Is there an opportunity for decision analysts in ethical decision-making and in organizations? I believe there are. There are many aspects that are taught in decision analysis courses that many ethics classes do not teach. Decision traps, creating better alternatives, reasoning with uncertainty, understanding values, assessing trade-offs, updating beliefs, patterns of descriptive behavior, cognitive biases, rationality, etc., etc. And all of these things are taught in decision analysis curricula, yet they are not really taught in ethics courses. Okay, well, is this the panacea then? Not really. Can you follow decision analysis rules and still make an unethical decision? Yes. So I remember Ron Howard used to say in classes at Stanford, the tools of decision analysis are amoral. So if you are going to apply decision analysis, you can apply them amorally. And so there is also perhaps a need to modify the teaching of decision analysis with a focus on ethical decision-making, perhaps understand some of the common ethical pitfalls that may occur in every step. And I'm going to give many examples. So question one right away, how do you assess the ethical quality of a decision with this background? The way I went about answering this was a scan of media articles, case studies, research papers, and looked at collapses that occurred and the weak elements or the elements that impacted ethical decision-making as a decision was made, and also identified the common ethical pitfalls within each element. So you can almost predictably predict that something will occur if you find these patterns. So those findings and a lot of data was used to assess the ethical implications of every step of the analysis, derive an ethical decision quality audit, which you can ask yourself or ask an organization. And then there were many great examples of ethical pitfalls when applying the steps of decision analysis that are included, and I'll give examples. And the findings are also useful understanding what are the impediments to ethical decision quality. All right, so without further ado, let's unveil the elements or the weak links that came up in the data search when there was an ethical collapse. So these are the elements of ethical decision quality. Awareness, because some people don't understand the difference between ethical, legal, etc. You can't expect people to make ethical decisions if they're unaware that an ethical situation has occurred. Motives, the environment, reasoning, rationalization, information, cognitive biases, alternatives, well-being, trade-offs, formulation, and stakeholders. And it has a nice acronym, America Working Together for Success as well. These elements, as you are making a decision or in an organization, you can check the strengths and weaknesses of these elements and see if there's a weak element or not, because these were the elements that were weak when there was a data or an ethical collapse. So I'll show you an example of how the elements were conceived. So let's take well-being, for example. How did we come up with that? Went through many ethical collapses that had an element of well-being related and then identified subcategories. So here's an example. The subcategories of well-being came up from the data based on how common they were. Addiction. Southern California nun, 80 years old, had an addiction to gambling and therefore took $835,000 from her school and went to gamble in Vegas and Lake Tahoe. So that was how the subcategory addiction was included with well-being. Stress. Many articles about Italian researchers participated. They found that those who were on fixed-term contracts, not on tenure, there was a high level of stress also related to unethical behaviors. But this is just an example. And so this is how stress belonged to the subcategory of well-being. Mental health. We had a situation in California where an officer shot a couple. And so they started doing psychological tests, and they found that many of them failed. They had to release their guns, but this only happened after a shooting. So mental health would belong to that category. Depression, anxiety. Many lawyers are involved in organizational ethical decision-making. This is a recent study published by the American Attorney Association. 28% of lawyers suffered from depression in their questionnaire. 19% suffered from anxiety. At some point in their career, 11.4% of lawyers felt that suicide might be a solution to their issues. This is a script from The Dropout, although this was from a Netflix documentary, but the story is real. An example of how stress in an organization can lead to unethical consequences. This was Ian Gibbons in Theranos. He was called for a deposition. And so he was worried that if he says something in the deposition that would violate the NDA, then he would be sued by Theranos. So it was kind of a lose-lose situation. And ultimately committed suicide. So these are the elements. I would like to highlight two more things and then open it up for questions. Examples of how you can use some of the findings in embedding ethical decision quality into the teaching and practice of decision analysis. Again, all of this came from data from real-life situations. So I'll start with the first one, the frame and the scope of the frame that we talk about. We have what is taken as given: to decide now, decide later. A great tool in identifying the scope because it helps you focus the analysis, understand what you can decide for later and what you are taking as given. Question is, suppose we have something like being honest. Is that taken as given, decide now, or decide later? And while we might look at this slide now and say, oh, but this is obvious, here's a real life situation where it wasn't. And when the Volkswagen diesel scandal occurred and the Department of Justice started investigating Volkswagen in America, the first thing that the executives in Volkswagen did was send an email asking the following question. It should first be decided whether we are honest. If we are not honest, everything stays as it is. Here is a case of Volkswagen, a true case, where as soon as the investigation started, so being honest was not taken as given. It was decided, it was kept, not even thought about. And then even when the investigation started, it wasn't saying, okay, well, we have to be honest. The question was, let's now decide now, are we honest or not? If not, so that was a decision that was put in the decide now category. This would be an example of how we can kind of embed some ethical stories in the teaching of and practice of decision analysis. How about to decide later? If you put something in the decide later category, can that have ethical implications? Yeah, so I have many, many examples, but this was a compelling one. When writing the Declaration of Independence, and in the search, by the way, I did a lot of quotes from Benjamin Franklin, and you'll find that he could have, he knew what he knew and he knew what he didn't know. He always acknowledged the limitations of the reasoning they had at the time. But there was a draft of the Declaration of Independence which had a clause about slavery. And in it, they were talking about how the King of England has waged a cruel war against human nature, slavery, he captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere to incur a miserable death. This would have been a clause or a paragraph in the Declaration of Independence. That didn't go well with some of the Southern delegates and even some of the Northern ones. So the paragraph was dropped. It was put in the decide later category. And about 87 years later, it was the end of slavery. But that's an example of, while framing the scope of the decision, to be decided later was involved in an unethical act. And it's something to think about. What you take is given, what you're going to decide now, what you will decide later, and the ethical implications that might have. Information, gathering information, the Tuskegee experiments, handling information. Many ethical failures we're seeing now. We've seen Cambridge Analytica, Equifax, Instagram, how you're handling information and how now the legal system is trying to impose fines. Wrongful convictions leading to half of court people, basically people getting arrested for no reason. We are good in decision analysis is coming up with sequential decision making, but even Benjamin Franklin noted that when you receive new information, you have to act upon it. We now know that there are many things like cognitive consistency, confirmation biases, sunk cost, that can make us not want to change a course of action even upon the revelation of information. And so these could be tied to the ethical implications. If you have seen the Netflix series Inventing Anna, motives. So there was a nice quote in that, which kind of summarizes a lot of what might impede ethical decision-making in organizations. Everyone here is running a game. Everyone is hustling. Everyone wants something. Money, power, image, love. Think about those motives and how they might impact ethical decision-making. Stakeholders. This was the first thing also that Mike Pearson of Valiant said when the investigations began. All I care about is our shareholders. So there was a need to clarify distinctions between a shareholder and a stakeholder and ethical implications. Okay, they can also be used as a checklist. So I'll give you an example of the assessment, then we'll open it up for questions. Media articles also suggested that there is a major confusion between what is legal and ethical. You know, the fact that the Supreme Court is having a code of ethics should tell us something that there indeed is a difference. Societal norms are not necessarily the moral standard because society disagrees on the norms. Public good, which was used to justify many things, for example, by Benjamin Franklin and onwards, need not be the moral standard. And ethics versus compliance, that today, many organizations, when they say ethics officers, they're compliance officers. So an example of how you can assess the awareness element when making a decision or within an organization, these also all came from media articles. Does the decision hand involve acts of deception, harming, or stealing? Are individuals involved in the decision aware of legal versus ethical? Are there company policies that are impacting the ethical decision-making, etc.? So that's an example. For each of these elements of ethical decision quality, there is an assessment that can be made. These came from data. Of course, it can be tailored depending on the context to other settings. Okay, let's open it up for some questions.
Yeah, we have a few really excellent questions that have come in. The first one is, how would someone conduct an audit in an organization? Unethical behaviors are always clothed in socially acceptable talk around.
Yeah, so maybe not always socially acceptable. I think the ones that are legal, the unethical behaviors that are legal are acceptable, because it will be a hard fight for someone to oppose them if they are legal. And if a lot of decisions are driven by a legal team, for example. But the types of questions that would be asked, as an example in awareness, you're just asking, as an example here, getting a sense, will the employees or leaders identify an ethical issue that is illegal? They probably will. Will they identify an ethical issue if it is legal? They probably won't. Will they identify an ethical issue if it does not violate a corporate policy? They probably won't. So this is how you would get a feel or a sense of the environment within the organization and its readiness to adapt an ethical decision quality or things that need to be done in that process.
Great. Another question is, can the ethical quality of a decision, EDQ, be evaluated ex ante like DQ? or can it only be determined from the outcome?
Yeah, so it definitely is not determined from the outcome. It is determined in advance. So you can assess either the ethical decision quality of a decision real time while you're making it by going through the assessments and the checklist, or you can assess an organizational's ethical decision quality culture, like the types of questions: do you believe the decision makers involved are aware? That's an awareness. But every one of those elements has a chapter and has its own ethical assessment kind of thing. So I guess that's the answer to that is, yes, it can be done real time. And it can also be, you can look at past ethical decisions and understand, just reflect what could have been some of the weak elements of ethical decision quality that led to that. So there are many examples when we look at, for example, during JFK's time, the Bay of Pigs invasion, they related that decision and the failures of the decision to cognitive biases. Some of them were group biases and obedience to authority. So just, friends and family being around, nobody was everybody was afraid to say no, and they changed the decision-making process based on the analysis and the failure that they recognized that there were a lot of group biases that were present during that decision.
Yeah, and a final quick question is, what are some impacts an organization may incur around poor ethical decision, like poor ethical quality decisions, right? Do you have any examples?
Yeah. So I analyzed some in depth and then some in just like green media articles. So the ones that I analyzed in depth were FTX, Wells Fargo, Volkswagen, Theranos, Enron. The interesting thing, and all of these had major implications. I mean, but what was interesting in the findings, and I'm happy to share some of this, is that when you look at 3 or 4, the patterns repeat. It didn't take many more, and I'll show a slide of this, that there were certain patterns that existed in most of the companies analyzed. Then you look at a new one. So in fact, I'll give an example. After writing the book and about to send it to the publisher, the FTX story came up. And so I started looking into some of the factors at FTX, and the patterns were repeatable. And so I added a chapter about FTX, just saying, it was a later chapter, just saying, hey, look at how repeatable the patterns were. Same types of patterns that we observed, they're repeating again. In fact, and I wrote the chapter even before the verdict on FTX came out. But the patterns were there. And so you could kind of predict that this was a situation which could lead to a collapse.
Nice. Well, we'll address some more questions at the break. We're getting really juicy stuff in the
Great.
Q&A. So it's
Thank
great.
you, Amy. Thank you.
Keep it coming.
Okay. So next question is, are there any predictable impediments or mindsets that impede ethical decision quality? And so this was another part of the research, is trying to look for first mindsets. And what I mean by mindsets, they are a set of attitudes, beliefs held by more than one person in the organization. And they are dominant enough that even if the organizational CEO leaves, they will still persist because they are present as dominant mindsets within the organization. They're inherent. So, of course, there were many. And those mindsets are mindsets that impede ethical decision quality. In other words, they affect each of the 11 elements that we talked about drastically when they are present. And when you have those 6 mindsets present, then you're in trouble. If you have only 1 or 2, of course, it depends on the severity, but the presence of those 6 mindsets is a huge predictor that there will be an ethical collapse. So what are those mindsets? So this was just an example that by looking at these situations, Enron, Valiant, Theranos, Volkswagen, Wells Fargo, you could see that the patterns were predictable in HSBC, FTX, and many others just by looking at the common patterns. So the following 6 mindsets came up. They were gleaned by scanning media articles. So the 6 are on the left. And I'll touch briefly on some of them, and then we will open it up for some more questions. The first mindset, which was dominant, is the legally unethical mindset, which is, if it is legal, then it is okay. And when you look at the quotes, indeed, you find it all over the place. I think we didn't find anything they were doing that was illegal. Volkswagen, their legality told them it was okay. Sometimes the legal system catches up. California has just put out a new law. The state now obligates attorneys to notify the state bar if they see credible evidence that another lawyer has either committed a criminal act or engaged in conduct involving dishonesty, fraud, or deceit. So the notion of, well, if it's legal, it is okay, even if there was some element of deceit, is now even becoming illegal, or there will be repercussions for it. So that's the first mindset. And you can think of that in your own organization, whether the organization really, if they found something that is legal, would they be okay with it, even if it involves aspects of deception, harming, and stealing. That's mindset number 1. Mindset number 2, which I call the black hole mindset, because it's like a black hole. They just cover up. If we can cover up and nobody finds out, then it is okay. What's interesting is there is a theorem in physics called the no-hiding theorem, which says that if information is never destroyed and there's always a copy somewhere else. So, this happened with Enron. It happened in many cases where they tried to hide the data, but there was data somewhere else, another copy existing somewhere. So this is the black hole mindset. Let's just cover up. Nobody will find out, then we'll be okay. Mindset 3 occurred a lot in Enron, Theranos, what I call pendulum swings. If unethical acts were conducted by these particular stakeholders, then it's okay. Again, very dominant mindset. Number 4, organizational transgressions. The justification or the rationalization is that if transgressions are in the interest of the organization, then it is okay. Look at Jeffrey Skilling's quote of Enron. I didn't do anything that wasn't in the best interest of the shareholders. Mike Pearson of Valiant. All I care about is our stakeholders. When the Volkswagen diesel scandal occurred in the US, and they said, well, what about Europe? Why isn't the European Union, or why aren't European countries also measuring the exhaust and seeing? And so this was an editor from there. He explained that, they know that every manufacturer is emitting exhaust of about 400, 500% more than the laboratory test. But every government in Europe is saying, should I harm my own national car industry if the others won't? No, I'm not going to do this. I'm not stupid. That's an example of the organizational transgression mindset. If those transgressions are in the organization's interest, then it's okay. No decision process mindset. If there is no decision process, I've built my stores, then it's okay. We can hide the trail. I do need to mention here, of course, Ron Howard, Carl Spetzler, Jim Matheson, Tom Keelan, many others have been advocating in the practice the need for sound decision-making in organizations. So the question is now, is not having a decision process unethical? I have come, when you look at it, I do believe that you can be unethical if you don't have a decision process. So an example, you can commit things unintentionally. Turns out, definitely, we are more generous toward a stranger if we have found a dime. A judge's decision to grant parole depends on how long it has been since he or she had lunch. Clearly, there is no decision process here. So Danny Kahneman would say this would be an example of noise. So if you don't have a decision process, then you can be unethical. But then you can also intentionally commit unethical acts without a decision process, outcome predetermined analysis, flawed methods, saving face, following the strongest wind direction is how you make the decisions, etc. So that's mindset number 5, opposing a decision process. Mindset number 6, or I call unethically fast and slow. You're slow when it comes to acknowledging or changing, but very fast to cover up. And there are many examples of this. Equifax, when the data breach occurred, for example, they never told anybody. And people, data was breached for more than a month, and people were wandering around not knowing. So that's kind of the other one. And sometimes the legal system steps in. So now there are recalls when a company observes something, they have to recall back. Automobile manufacturers are very fast at this now. Other companies, not so fast. But that's the example of the unethically fast and slow mindset. This is an example of how you can audit a mindset. So here is the auditing the no decision process mindset. How are decisions made? How are they made on a group level? Are they made in isolation? Is there a decision process, etc.? So this is just an example of a questionnaire where you can identify this. Okay, so we can pause. And also while we're pausing, think, can you identify additional or other mindsets within your organization that might be prevalent? I'm not saying these are the only ones. I'm just saying that they were very dominant in the data, and that when they exist, this is a red flag that, hey, you should be expecting an ethical collapse. So we can open it up for questions.
Yeah, I was going to say, it takes a second to come off. Yeah, I have a few more amazing questions coming in. And I just want to mention, we're going to address as many questions as possible. Ali has generously offered to answer your questions via email, like make a document for you. So if we don't get your question, we'll be addressing them in that email. So much of your presentation focuses on observed behavior. We realize that there is a big difference between actual versus espoused behavior. If the organizations that espoused integrity actually acted with integrity, would the failure still have happened?
That's a great question. So as we've seen, 65% say integrity. And many of them do it for advertising, because if they don't have integrity on there, then that won't help. In fact, one of the questions that came up in one of the links was, okay, we can implement ethical decision quality, but is it a good decision to be ethical? And what is the value of ethics? So if the organizations had implemented integrity, let's get back to that. So I think, first of all, and this relates, I believe, to corporate values in general. Corporate values are put there. They think, what is cool? I mean, how can it be a coincidence that 65% put integrity? There is some copying effect. There is trying to go with the current trend effect. And yet they don't really define the bounds. See, and of course, behavioral experiments have shown a lot that, for example, people are willing to tolerate unethical behaviors for small amounts, but not for larger amounts. So when you say integrity, how do you define it? Where are they defining what I'm calling the ethical tolerance? Where am I going to the ethical trade-offs that might be involved? That isn't specified. And many corporate values, when they say, well, we care about safety, we care about people, we care about integrity, are there any trade-offs or tolerances mentioned with that? What is the trade-off between, if we can do an extra safety inspection check that will save this many lives, then we will do it because this is our trade-offs. Trade-offs are not specified in corporate values. And then when you add things like integrity, that's not it's a very vague. So when you say we're going to operate with integrity, it's kind of like the when you Google what is unethical act, and the Cambridge and the Merriam-Webster definition comes up of not conforming to a high moral standard. So it would need more refinement. It would need more specificity. And it would definitely need a commitment from them that they really mean it, and they're not just putting it up there because everybody else is putting it up there.
Yeah, we can thank Carl Spetzler for that awesome question.
Thank you, Carl.
We have another one. Aren't ethics determined by whatever ethical standards one adopts? For example, are deception, stealing, and harming a universal standard, or could one reasonably adopt other elements within one's standard?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question as well, and I want to emphasize this. So these were just gleaned from looking at things the Department of Justice investigated or ethical collapses. There was an element of deception, which extended to fraud. There was an element of stealing. There was an element of harm, mental or physical. Yes, so for sure, different people might have more, they can add more to that, but the methodology will remain the same. The assessments, in other words, this will impact the ethical awareness, which you want people in the organization to be ethically sensitive to. And so they cover quite a bit of the ethical decisions we face in an organization. For sure, different people might have different views, but those could be their definition, and they could include that. Now, there was a time in the Roman Empire, in the Colosseum, where people were put in to kill each other for the entertainment of others. So societal norms itself are not necessarily an indication of the moral value. So it can't be left entirely. And these are things, when we say deception, harming, and stealing, those you do, or those you tolerate, or those you bribe others to do, or those, are things that I think many people would agree on. And not only that, they would have covered, if we look at all of the ethical collapses and say, let's identify the ones which didn't have an element of deception, harming, or stealing, I think we are not going to find many. So yes, you can modify it with caution that societal norms are not necessarily that. Those were chosen based on a lot of occurrences, and they were chosen with the idea that society is not the norm. And there are things that I think nobody would say deception is ethical. They might tolerate knowing it's like a white lie. That would be deception, but they believe that they would justify it or rationalize it with the purpose that some good is coming out of it. So.
Right. Great. Okay, so we have like 12 more minutes, Ali. Would you like to continue with some questions, or would you like to continue on and then we'll do more questions at the very end?
Sure. Let me present a few more, and then we can answer some questions. So there, and likewise, like the definition of deception, harming, there might also be other mindsets, and that's fine. I was just trying to pick the top ones, and the ones that, when they existed collectively, there were large ethical collapses. Okay. The next question is, okay, so this is all good. And it comes to a question that was in response to a post on LinkedIn. Should you have, what is the value of ethics? There has been a lot of debate and research about, some people would say, even if you're unethical, it's prudent to be ethical because, like the companies that put integrity, because if you don't, you're going to lose out on money. So it's prudent for you to be ethical or claim you're ethical just because you're going to make more money. That's an argument. But here, I actually think that this is more about, do you want to really be, and it comes back to Carl's question, when you say integrity, do you really mean it? This is also, when you say, I'm going to have an ethical decision culture, do you really mean it or not? And if you want that, like you don't want to be operating in a situation where ethical decision-making is a wink-wink or left without a decision process. And so the first question is, do you want to have an ethical decision culture or not? Remember this quote from Volkswagen. It should first be decided whether we are honest. If we're not honest, everything stays as it is. So maybe you don't want to have it. That's fine. It's up to, but if you do, I like this quote from The Wolf of Wall Street. By the way, there are many quotes in the book just because they came up from data search. Without action, the best intentions in the world are nothing more than that, intentions. So you might want to have it, but you have to do something about it. And we've seen that 65% of corporations have integrity in their core values as of 2020. When it came to ethical decision-making, having integrity in the core values did not help. It was vague. And it wouldn't be, just putting it in the core values is not a guide to decision-making. It might, how do you think of it? What are the bounds? What are the tolerances, etc.? And so the question is, are organizations willing to take a challenge to say, taken as given, we're going to have ethical decision quality? Volkswagen didn't have that, but that is a test. Are we going to have an ethical decision culture in the organization? And if so, what would need to be done, right? So I've just looked at, one is, some of the recommendations, again, we don't have enough time to present everything, but one, at least conduct a ethical decision quality assessment in your organization. Get the feedback on how strong or weak each element is when it comes to EDQ. That would be a first step. And, those can be brought in anonymously if people are afraid, but that by itself is an indication. Identify organizational mindset. So there's also a mindset audit, but it could also be tailored to the organization at hand. Beef up the elements of ethical decision quality. If you find weak elements, address them. Highlight by examples. I mean, if we can put many examples while teaching and practicing decision analysis of the ethical pitfalls that occurred in the steps of decision quality, that I think could help raise the sensitivities towards them. And it would be compelling to highlight real life examples, and there is many right now. We talked, for example, about improving the generation of decision alternatives. You might want to put a little more thought also into improving the generation of ethical decision alternatives. Because if you can put more effort into coming up with alternatives that might appeal to different stakeholders that you otherwise would not have thought about, this might help resolve some of the ethical issues at hand. So that's what I mean by beef up the elements of ethics, being clear about your ethical tolerances, your trade-offs, ethical trade-offs. This is an example. Being clear about risk tolerance. And people say, well, how does risk tolerance relate to ethics? When you look at the history of Enron, for example, there were many traders that were gambling with the future of the company, way above the tolerance that they should have been. They were actually risk-seeking, and that led to an escalation of commitment into some of the deception that occurred later. Another thing is restructuring. And this, I think, is an important thing, a message that needs to be highlighted. First, ethics officers should really be ethics officers, not compliance officers. And we've seen many examples of how corporate policies can actually lead to an escalation of ethical issues. Two, I think the legal team should have EDQ training, like ethical decision quality. Imagine if you have a legal team that is also very well ingrained in decision-making and also in ethical decision-making, EDQ. I believe there is room for EDQ for the decision team as well. So these would be types of restructuring or things you can do in an organization. But then, of course, incentive structures, looking at the impact of incentive structures on ethical decision-making behavior, the stress, some of the incentive structures in Enron are what led many people to do some of the things just so that they can achieve their targets. Wells Fargo was the same when they were opening up accounts because they had impossible targets to achieve. And then step 5, I say, give yourself an ethics nudge. So it's really up to you. You can decide that, hey, next decision I'm going to make after, while I'm in the process, I'm just going to go through those elements of ethical decision quality, check, make sure that things are okay. Try to improve, see if you have personal motives, that might be changing the quality of the decisions that are being there or not. So that's what I'm calling give yourself an ethics nudge. All right. Thank you. These are the elements. And I don't know how we're doing on time, but if there are any questions or so, I'll pass it on to Amy. Thanks.
Yes, we have some excellent questions. And as I said, he'll go through the questions and answer them in a document as well. I love this idea of the decision analyst having an opportunity to actually incorporate this whole ethics piece in their work in offering a new layer to their analysis. And there's a great question. Most of the mindsets you identified are characterizations of the organization's rationalizations or cover-up once they're caught and subject to public scandal. Okay. So lagging indicators. Are there leading indicators like that we can be watching for?
Yeah, so those definitely are, when an ethical scandal occurs, those mindsets were present. But I think you can ask many people, for example, look, it's a simple question. Is your organization, the term which I'm calling, legally unethical? In other words, is your organization willing to engage in unethical acts if they are legal? Do you believe that from your experience with the leadership? Do you, yes or no? They can answer that question. Do you believe that the leaders are making ethical choices, that they would reject a decision if it's unethical, even if it were legal? So you can get a sense for that from people in the organization. And that ultimately also it is, the question is, it should first be decided whether we are honest. I love that message. It's actually true. It's up to the organization. If we are honest, if we're not honest, everything stays as it is. Well, but the chances are that if you have those mindsets and you don't work on them, that's what you need to do. There's a part in the presentation I didn't show just because of time of reactions managers have when those mindsets are present. You would think that they would say, okay, let's acknowledge now and let's work on improving them. No, it's actually the opposite. When you bring in a new leader and they find the mindsets, they immediately raise the "we are the champions of morality" flag. They raise other flags and to kind of take the focus away from the mindsets. And that's why they prevail.
Nice. Yeah, there were some great questions for specific examples about the Boeing 737, university presidents, politics.
Yeah.
I mean, I just think this topic weaves through so many areas where we're making big decisions. And this idea that you just, talked about people sort of covering up rather than taking the moment to reveal it, to expose what's not working. I think that's in decision quality. I see that as not outing people, but saying, hey, I noticed this thing's happening, to invite people to make change. Do you feel like there's any advocacy that's currently being led to create these types of decision processes that integrate ethics?
I think that would be, organizational specific, if there are advocates for it. I feel we as a decision analysis society and a society of decision professionals, can start spreading this word. Because I don't know of many CEOs or leaders who would want to have an ethical collapse and end up in the news. And so perhaps by doing this, you're kind of helping at least remove some of the mindsets and at least moving them in that direction. I think it takes awareness that we could help promote awareness. I do believe, though, that there is, when you look at the people involved in ethical decision-making in an organization, it's a legal team, it's a legal counsel, which is okay, but I think if they had also ethical decision quality training, I think that would help us improve more.
Nice. Well, we're out of time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for his fascinating presentation. As Amy said, we will follow up with an email. And I believe there is a little glitch with the discount code for your book, Ali. So we'll work on it and we will follow up with an email with the correct codes. Well, again, thank you, Ali and Amy, for this fascinating presentation, and thank you to our attendees for making it so engaging and for your participation. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's webinar. We will be following, you can find the webinar and all previous presentations in the Society of Decision Professionals website at decisionprofessionals.com. Thank you again, and you may now disconnect.